The Oval Office is boiling over after Kenya imposes a staggering 600% tariff on American tech imports, sparking fears of a diplomatic and economic crisis. For the United States, this unprecedented move by one of Africa's rising economies is more than just an isolated trade dispute. It represents a seismic shift in the balance of global tech trade. What prompted this drastic move from Kenya, a key US ally in Africa? How will this decision shape US-Kenya relations? And what does it mean for American tech giants like Google, Microsoft, and Apple? As this tariff crisis unfolds, the broader implications for global trade dynamics and international relations could not be more significant, posing new questions about the future of global economic power and trade alliances. Background: US-Kenya trade relations. For years, the United States and Kenya have enjoyed a steady, mutually beneficial relationship. U.S. trade with Kenya has typically revolved around agriculture, with the U.S. importing Kenyan flowers, tea, and coffee, while Kenya receives American technology, machinery, and aid. Over time, this trade landscape has expanded, with Kenya increasingly emerging as a regional tech hub. But despite the growing ties, the relationship has always been somewhat one-sided, with Kenya often dependent on foreign technology and investment. That dynamic has begun to change, with Kenya's expanding digital economy and its aspirations for a more self-sufficient future now challenging US dominance in the tech sector. In the past decade, Kenya has skyrocketed as a technological powerhouse in East Africa. Dubbed Silicon Savannah, Nairobi has become a magnet for international tech investment, particularly in mobile banking, fintech, and e-commerce. Pioneering platforms like M-Pesa have transformed the country's financial landscape, proving that Kenya's digital potential is far greater than many initially thought. This tech boom, coupled with a government determined to support digital innovation, has made Kenya the beating heart of Africa's tech revolution. US companies have played a massive role in this transformation. American tech giants have flocked to Kenya, eager to tap into its rapidly growing market and the opportunity to connect the continent to the digital age. From Google's investments in internet connectivity and local partnerships, to Microsoft's efforts to provide affordable access to technology, US companies have long seen Kenya as a promising market. Big names like Google, Microsoft, and IBM have all made a mark in Kenya's tech scene. Google's presence in Nairobi has been significant, with its launch of Google for Startups Africa, creating hubs to mentor local talent. Microsoft has similarly put down roots, partnering with Kenyan universities to nurture a new generation of tech entrepreneurs. Apple, though less dominant, is expanding its reach with initiatives to support app development across the continent. These companies have played an instrumental role in shaping Kenya's tech landscape, but in doing so, they've created a relationship where their influence is undeniable and now potentially at risk. In recent years, Kenya has worked to create a more diversified economy, one that can stand on its own without relying heavily on external assistance. This has included moving away from a dependency on foreign investment to bolster local industries, particularly tech. With a growing emphasis on homegrown solutions and a desire for greater control over its technological future, Kenya has become more protective of its market, eager to cultivate local talent and innovation without the overwhelming influence of foreign giants. This shifting dynamic has created an environment where Kenya is asserting more power, even at the risk of jeopardizing partnerships with major US firms. The imposition of a 600% tariff on American tech imports is a clear sign that Kenya is no longer content to simply play the role of a passive partner. As Kenya steps into the digital spotlight, the nation's drive for independence and self-sufficiency is reshaping its relationship with global powers, with the US caught in the crossfire. The trigger: why Kenya imposed a 600% tariff. Kenya's sudden decision to impose a staggering 600% tariff on American tech imports has left many scratching their heads, but the reasons behind this bold move are more complex than they first appear. On one hand, it's easy to view the tariff as a retaliatory action, perhaps aimed at protecting Kenya's own developing tech sector, or sending a message to US companies that their influence in the region is no longer as welcome as it once was. But what if it's something more than just a response to external pressures? Could it be part of a larger plan by Kenya's government to assert greater control over its tech landscape and reduce its dependency on foreign powers? The country's economic trajectory is undergoing a major shift, and this tariff could be the first sign of that transformation. At the heart of Kenya's decision is a growing desire for economic self-sufficiency. For years, Kenya has been heavily reliant on foreign corporations, particularly US tech giants like Google, Microsoft, and Apple, whose operations have been central to the country's tech growth. However, Kenya's government has set its sights on a more ambitious goal, becoming a hub for homegrown innovation and reducing its dependency on external tech powers. The Vision 2030 plan, which aims to transform Kenya into a middle-income economy, is central to this ambition. But can Kenya really chart its own path without risking alienation from global partners? And what role does this tariff play in the country's long-term strategy to nurture local talent, build infrastructure, and foster self-sustaining growth? The imposition of this tariff could signal that Kenya is no longer content to rely on foreign investments without demanding more in return. It's also worth considering how US companies have contributed to the tension. While their investments in Kenya have brought technological advancements and development, they've also faced accusations of exploitative practices, particularly in areas like job creation and infrastructure development. American companies have often been criticized for not doing enough to empower the local workforce, choosing instead to rely on foreign labor or not investing in sustainable infrastructure. Could this 600% tariff be a direct response to these long-standing frustrations? Is Kenya's government saying enough is enough, demanding that foreign tech giants contribute more to the country's growth and prosperity? And could this tariff serve as a wake-up call to US companies that the rules of engagement in Kenya are changing? Another layer to this decision is the growing influence of the African Union. As part of a continent-wide push for more regional self-reliance, many African nations have begun to question their long-standing economic ties with the West. Kenya's government, which has historically sought to balance its global partnerships, may now be leaning more toward cooperation with other African nations. Could the African Union's calls for greater economic independence be a factor in Kenya's decision to take a stronger stance against Western influence? If so, what message is Kenya sending to other nations in Africa, especially those who have felt the weight of Western corporate power for decades? But it's impossible to ignore the rising influence of China and Russia in Africa. As Kenya strengthens its ties with these two global powers, particularly in the realm of tech investments and infrastructure projects, it's clear that the country is looking for alternatives to its reliance on Western companies. Could the tariff be an indication that Kenya is ready to diversify its partnerships, shifting away from US dominance in favor of Chinese and Russian support? With both China and Russia eager to expand their influence in Africa, could this tariff be part of a broader strategy to signal to the West that Kenya is open to new partners, ones that offer fewer conditions and more investment in local growth? So, what does all of this mean for the future of US-Kenya trade relations? Could this tariff be the start of a much larger shift in global trade dynamics, particularly in the tech sector? Economic impact: the US tech industry on the brink. With companies like Google, Apple, Microsoft, and Facebook now scrambling to assess the long-term implications, these giants have long relied on African markets, including Kenya, for both sales and development. But the new tariffs threaten to disrupt not only the direct operations of these companies, but also their broader growth plans across the African continent. As these companies face higher costs for doing business in Kenya, the impact will ripple across the wider East African market, where Kenya often serves as a regional hub for the tech industry. The tariffs could make US tech products more expensive, causing consumers to turn to alternatives, particularly from China, which has already made significant inroads into Africa's tech sector. This move is poised to send shockwaves through global supply chains as well. Products like smartphones, computers, and software, which rely on Kenya both as a consumer and a base for regional production, will likely see price hikes or reduced availability. Tech supply chains in Africa could be heavily disrupted, particularly if other nations follow Kenya's lead and impose similar tariffs. With companies unable to absorb the increased costs without sacrificing profits, the entire structure of US-led tech distribution in Africa may face a major shakeup. What's more, local manufacturers in Kenya and neighboring nations may find themselves caught between rising costs for foreign tech products and growing pressure to adopt local or non-Western alternatives. As Kenya takes a stand on its own terms, one thing is clear: the global order is changing, and Kenya is making it clear that it intends to be a key player in that transformation. But as the dust settles from Kenya's seismic move, the global implications are just beginning to unfold. It is a dramatic shift in trade patterns, one that could benefit competitors or disrupt the long-standing dominance of American firms in East Africa. The global response, geopolitical, and trade implications. The White House and State Department are under intense pressure to respond to Kenya's bold tariff move, which threatens to upend years of diplomatic and trade relations between the US and one of East Africa's most promising markets. The US government has several options at its disposal. It could impose retaliatory tariffs, seek to leverage diplomatic channels to reverse Kenya's decision, or push for sanctions as a way to force Kenya back to the negotiating table. However, Kenya's growing ties with China and Russia complicate the situation. Will Washington risk escalating tensions with Nairobi over a single tariff, or will it take a more strategic approach to secure its tech interests across the continent? Other African nations will be watching Kenya's move closely. Some may even take inspiration from Kenya's bold stance, especially given the growing sentiment across the continent that the West has been extracting resources and wealth without offering commensurate benefits. If other nations follow suit, US tech giants could face a broader trade war with Africa, making the continent a much less predictable and potentially hostile place for business. In such a scenario, African governments may seize the moment to demand greater stakes in the global tech economy, pushing for more local manufacturing, partnerships, and technology transfers from US firms. This shift could also have far-reaching consequences for the global tech trade. If Kenya's actions spark a broader regional push to decouple from US tech dominance, American firms may look to Europe and Asia to mitigate losses. This could lead to new trade agreements and alliances, particularly in emerging markets like China and Russia, which are keen to expand their footprint in Africa. As the geopolitical landscape shifts, Africa's tech future may no longer be as tied to the West as it once was. At the heart of these developments is one critical question: how will US companies adapt to a changing global marketplace where Africa, long a promising market, is no longer as reliant on Western tech imports? The political fallout in Washington, a domestic crisis. The tariff bombshell out of Nairobi didn't just shake Wall Street, it hit the White House like a thunderclap. President Trump, blindsided by Kenya's audacious 600% levy on US tech imports, erupted in classic form. In a fiery morning press conference, he called the move a disgraceful betrayal by a country we helped rise, and vowed swift retaliation. Behind closed doors, aides scrambled to draft executive orders, with Trump reportedly demanding an America First trade strike in response. On Capitol Hill, reaction split down familiar lines, but with a twist. Republicans rallied behind Trump's aggressive posture, calling the tariff a direct attack on US sovereignty and innovation. If Kenya thinks it can walk all over American tech, they've got another thing coming, one senator thundered. Meanwhile, some Democrats urged caution, warning that escalating the crisis could push other African nations into similar defiance. But even moderates admitted this wasn't just about Kenya anymore. Public sentiment was just as volatile. American tech workers, already on edge from layoffs and automation fears, are seeing the Kenyan tariff as a new threat to job security. Social media erupted with frustration. Why wasn't the US better prepared? Why are American companies suddenly vulnerable in regions once seen as friendly turf? Inside the Trump administration, pressure is boiling over. Tech lobbyists want immediate protection. Economic advisors are torn between retaliatory tariffs and diplomatic overtures. Trump, however, seems to have made up his mind. They want a tech war, he declared. We'll give them one. As Congress debates the next move, whether to cut Kenya out of AGOA, impose new sanctions, or fast-track alternative trade pacts, a larger question looms over Washington. Has Trump's hardline trade policy finally met its match, not in Beijing or Brussels, but in Nairobi? Kenya's economic and political calculations. For Nairobi, the 600% tariff wasn't just about numbers, it was about narrative. At the heart of Kenya's bold move lies a calculated strategy rooted in economic self-determination and a defiant assertion of national pride. For too long, Kenyan policymakers argue the country has played second fiddle to foreign tech conglomerates who extract value without reinvesting meaningfully in the local economy. This time, they're drawing a line. Behind closed doors, Kenyan officials see the tariff not as a gamble, but as a long overdue correction. The goal? To wean the nation off its heavy reliance on American imports and catalyze a digital renaissance powered by local innovation. If that sounds ambitious, that's because it is. But the government is betting big. Increased support for startups, tax breaks for local developers, and expanded digital infrastructure could finally lay the groundwork for a self-sustaining tech ecosystem. In the long run, Kenya hopes to gain more than just leverage. It wants leadership. By shielding its market from foreign dominance, Nairobi Nairobi sees a path to job creation, technological independence, and greater influence across the African continent. After all, if Kenya can defy Silicon Valley and survive, what's to stop others from following suit? This isn't happening in a vacuum. Kenya's Digital Superhighway Initiative and Konza Technopolis project, once seen as moonshots, are now front and center in the national strategy. And in a region hungry for role models, Kenya's actions could spark a chain reaction. Nigeria, South Africa, even Ethiopia, they're all watching closely. So was this a moment of reckless defiance or a masterstroke of economic statecraft? That depends on what happens next and whether Kenya's vision of a tech future free from US dependency can actually take hold. Looking ahead, what this means for US-Africa relations. Kenya's tariff isn't just a policy decision, it's a signal, a sharp, unmistakable flare fired into the sky of global trade, warning that the old dynamics between the global north and the global south are no longer guaranteed. For decades, the US enjoyed near unquestioned access to African markets, especially in sectors like tech. But this latest move suggests the tide is shifting, and Washington might not be the one steering anymore. For US tech companies, the fallout is already being felt, with Kenya's bold step acting as both warning and precedent. Firms like Apple, Google, and Microsoft are quietly reassessing their African strategies. Protectionism is rising, and the era of unchecked expansion is being replaced by one of negotiation, local partnerships, and perhaps humility. At the same time, China and Russia are moving in with precision, where American firms see setbacks, Beijing and Moscow see opportunity, offering infrastructure, investments, and fewer political strings. From Huawei's dominance in telecom to Russia's overtures in cybersecurity and data centers, the alternatives are no longer theoretical, they're already here. But this story isn't just about superpowers, it's about Africa itself. Countries like Kenya are asserting that they're not just markets to be mined, but players with vision, leverage, and ambition. Across the continent, tech hubs are growing. Rwanda's innovation centers, Nigeria's fintech explosion, and South Africa's AI research aren't just anomalies, they're early chapters in a new digital narrative. So is this the beginning of a more self-defined, tech-driven Africa, one less reliant on Western giants and more focused on internal capacity and regional collaboration? If so, the next decade of US-Africa relations won't be shaped in Silicon Valley. It'll be shaped in Nairobi, Lagos, and Kigali.